Now a turn towards history. I want to emphasize certain elements of history. This isn't a church history class, but because my own interest in Wesley and related issues certainly found its blossoming in my church history minors PhD studies. I wrote a lot about Wesley as part of that. And as a church historian in part, I like the idea of how history gives texture to our doctrines. We give understanding. It's very hard to understand Wesley if you were to start purely from a non-historical, as if Wesley just existed and his ideas just came forth written without context. All theology is contextual. So there was a certain move for many hundreds of years to say that European theology was the core systematic theology, and we can talk about theologies coming from Africa or Latin America or Asia as contextual theologies. These are theologies that are concerned with the issues in those places, whereas we have the objective theology in Europe or North America. This is not true. All theology is contextual. All theology is derived from experiences and questions and concerns, philosophies, and all the things that go into an era. And if you want to understand how a person develops and the trajectory, because that's part of the interest here, is not just the content, but also the trajectory, so that we can understand how we can apply Wesleyan theology in our context, in our era. It's important to look at what fed into Wesley so we can say, how did he shape the things we did? In the last discussion, we talked about the early church influences. We talked about scripture. We talked about Wesley himself and his experiences in Georgia, experiences in ministry. So now we're going to take a step back, Wesley's storyline. Look at Wesley's own root and look at Samuel Annesley and a pure church. What do I mean by that? We're going to talk a little bit about the Puritans. Puritan theology developed in the late 16th century as a response to a narrowed religious civil religion. Religion had really taken on a kind of civil role that secured power, that was part of and almost inseparable from the civil society at the time, rather than really leading to change and transformation and a kind of experience that reflected Christ. Does that sound familiar? It seems to happen in every era, and it certainly happened in our era. So what is the response? In every era, there have been people in these various churches who say, no, we can't just let this be about form and function and these actions we do simply for their own purposes. These aren't just rites for their own sake. There's a meaning in this. There's a critique in what is happening that should call us back to being radical disciples of Christ. Well, that's how the Puritans developed. Now, I know the Puritans get a little bit of a bad reputation based on a lot of distorted history and their later history, but the Puritans really themselves had a core value of restoration, to bring the church back into orientation with Christ. Puritans believed that the work of God related to the whole of life. There wasn't a sphere separate from God's calling. So government, every part of life, our actions, our marriages, our singleness, our sexuality, our work, all the things that we see as part of life, these are all impacted by God's calling. Primarily Reformed in perspective, the Puritans sought a pure Church of England through inner reforms, or rarely at first actual separation. The Puritans wanted to purify the church. They saw them as an inner reform movement primarily. There were some movements that sought geographic separation in order to pursue their more idealized perspective. So we see a group of Puritans going off into the American colonies. Massachusetts was formed by this, but they were still connected to the Church of England. In fact, Roger Williams, an early Puritan and then the first Baptist, a very radical Christian in his own right, argued against and actually separated from the Puritans of Rhode Island because he didn't think they should be associating with those he saw as less pure or corrupted leaders in the Church of England, whereas the Puritans said, no, we still have a relationship here, even though we have a geographic separation. So the Puritan tradition in Massachusetts was a mix of these. It saw a need for a particular setting while staying in communion with the Church of England, as they discussed. So Puritans believed that God's salvific grace could be identified in human experience. If you're saved by Jesus, that should have some kind of actual palpable, acknowledged impact. You can't just be saved and then say, well, nothing's changed in my life and I don't feel anything. Scripture seems to indicate otherwise. There's an expressive element to God's work. So the Puritans were really, they're not known for this. They tend to be known for their narrow legalism, but that's actually not true. They really was a strong emphasis on expression of experience. There's an expressive element to God's work that results in inner transformation from a life of sin to a life of Christ. So they wanted to know when this happened, how this happened. They had testimonies about this. Puritan theology likely peaked in the early 17th century, reaching its social climax as a defining presence in the American colonies, 1630s. This is where they really were able to put all that was Puritan theology into a specific society where they didn't have any outside forces helping them change. What it would have looked like in full, this is what it looked like. And then a decade later in England, with his victory in the English Civil War, in which the Puritans, who were part of Parliament, no longer were able to, saw a possibility of working with the king or other movements in the Church of England, so they actually overthrew the monarchy. They installed Oliver Cromwell as the new head of government, a massive experience in English history beyond the discussion, but this is really where the Puritans gained full political and social power. It didn't work out as well as they'd hoped, and later on we see what's called the Restoration, when the monarchy is returned, and the reduction of Puritanism and the corruption of Puritanism even. With the Restoration in 1660, the Puritan movement began a social decline. With the spiritual decline probably just started earlier, but it really became significantly less socially accepted. The Puritans came in with a storm and really the authoritarian kind of leadership by Cromwell and Parliament with him showed it was this, different people in the same system. It was a different kind of control, yet without the same kind of traditions or other elements. And so they want to change, as happens in politics. Revolutions often replace one tyrant with another. And so rather than being a broadly social transforming that really reflect the underlying values of Puritan goals to conform society to Christ-likeness, the Puritan leadership of England in the mid-1600s was very much like other movements. They persecuted those who disagreed with them religiously. They invaded. Cromwell's role in the subjugation of Ireland is infamous. There is such a profound lack of actual Christ-likeness in the Puritan rule that it undermined the attempt or idea that a spiritual movement can take a theological and political control. And this is important. It's not the primary focus of this class, but it's important because it really shapes how then later English and then American understanding of religion and the religion's role in society developed. And thus also Wesley's own perspective on religious rule, religious control from above, as opposed to from below, where it's a transformation among the people that then has broad social change rather than imposed from above. So the goal would be to seek political power first. We can see a loose analogy in this with American evangelicalism. A renewal movement in the 1940s, the goal of it was to move away from the anti-intellectualism and anti-public involvement of fundamentalism to become more socially, politically, and intellectually engaged. As it became more and more increasingly political, especially in the early 1980s and beyond, it changes its goals and its reputation. So rather than evangelicalism enjoying a kind of favored renewal perspective as it had in the 40s and 50s and even through the 60s, it now is a demographic, a voting bloc that primarily votes conservative. And you can see that in the news. Now, of course, media has changed over the last 30 years, as has social acceptance of renewal movements in general. People don't really want evangelicalism to be successful in its actual goals of spiritual renewal either, because they reject those. But That said, the way evangelicalism has often been co-opted by politics to see politics as the way of imposing Christian transformation very much reflects the Puritan model. And you can also see this in the Christian left increasingly. So I don't want to just highlight only those on the Christian right. The Christian left and the Christian right seem to disagree on what politics we should have, while there's a shared agreement that religious, spiritual goals, essentially, should be imposed by taking political power and then imposing those on others. Is that true? Is there a role of politics? Of course there's a role of politics, but then how this takes shapes and how this shapes debates in various religious and social circles. And then we can learn a lot from the English experience in the 1600s. Let's go on. The overthrow of Charles I was certainly not supported by all Puritans. So like in today's era, where you can say evangelicals have a tendency to vote in one way, but not all evangelicals support that, or vice versa. There were a number of those who were Puritans who really saw politics as something to avoid, who saw this new step of imposing a violent revolution as actually going against Puritan priorities and values and methods, who saw the ends do not necessarily justify the means. Among these was a man named Samuel Annesley. Now, Samuel Annesley was John Wesley's maternal grandfather. Susanna Annesley's Wesley's father. We'll talk more about her in a little bit. He was really one of the most important Puritans of the mid-1600s. He was a primary preacher and pastor in one of the most important churches in London, which of course is one of the most important churches in England, now the UK. So when we talk about Samuel Annesley, we're not talking about an obscure figure, someone who's on the margins. We're talking about a key vocal pastoral leader. He wasn't into the political side, but he was a true pastor. He didn't support the Puritan rule, but of course when your party comes in power, even if you don't support everything, you enjoy the kinds of influence and success that comes with that. So whereas he was opposed in many ways to Cromwell's and the Parliament's work, because Puritan thought gained social sway and religious importance, when the people in power of a certain religious bent, they tend to encourage that religion bent across society. So those who follow that also enjoy power. But with that said, he really did represent the best aspects of a Puritan spiritual leader. He was a pastor. He wasn't a politician. He was a pastor. He wasn't seeking after power. He was really seeking, throughout all his works, and it showed, a deepening relationship, an active relationship with Christ that resonates across personal and social boundaries. He wanted people to live out their calling. Does that sound familiar? Annesley really was an accomplished minister, and if you want to read his works, he was actually able to gather together other dissenting, which is what they were later called after the Restoration, gather together these ministers for regular preachings. And the text, which he compiled in 6 volumes, called The Morning Exercises at Cripplegate. Cripplegate was the church that they preached at. So you can find these online. I almost had these for reading, but again, we have too much reading already. So feel free to find these on their own if you want to see some of the best of Puritan preaching, some really amazing examples of preaching in the 17th century, and to see Wesley's own influences. It's a really worthwhile volumes to find, and you can find them free online. In addition to these significant volumes that really represented some of the best practical theology of the era, he was also able to pass on a more significantly lasting legacy through his youngest daughter. Maybe his most important legacy that reaches to us still, for most people don't know who Samuel Annesley is, yet he impacted his daughter in a profound way, and his daughter was a profound influence on one of the key figures of this course. Because Annesley was closest to his youngest daughter, and maybe for other reasons as well, he asked that she take his library and papers after his death, which shows that even though she was the youngest of 25, that it wasn't a loose relationship. He seemed to see in her some kind of caretaker status, so she had all his remaining items. But sadly, there was a major fire. We talked about that fire with John Wesley's own experiences. He barely saved from that. And in that fire was a lot of extremely important material about John Wesley's childhood, about John Wesley's parents, and all of Samuel Annesley's writings then. We don't know a lot about Samuel Annesley because the writings were destroyed in that fire. Daniel Defoe gave the eulogy at Samuel Annesley's funeral. And he wrote a poem in honor of his pastor's leadership. So Daniel Defoe, one of the most important authors in English writing and also author of the time, it shows the kind of influence that Annesley had and the kind of impact he had. He was having celebrities in his congregation. His poem includes this great line: "The world, whose nature is to fade and die, must change and take up immortality, and time, which to eternity rolls on, must change and be eternity begun." Profound eschatological statement that really exemplifies the kind of attitude where the world is going horrible, but there's a transformation that happens in Christ that awakens possibilities, and this change can happen even now. We don't wait till some future end, but we take into eternity even now. After her oldest son died in 1739, Susanna wrote to Charles about her father. As your good old grandfather often used to say, "That's an affliction that God makes an affliction. For surely the manifestation of his presence and favor is more than an adequate support under any suffering whatever. But if he withhold his consolation and hide his face from us, the least suffering is intolerable." The statement of Annesley's perspective on grace and God's presence and the experiential quality of faith, which shows what Wesley's priority of this didn't derive purely from the Moravians. There's a real interest in the experiential faith that comes through his grandfather and through his mother to them. Certainly the Moravians were important, but these were reminders for Wesley, and in a certain sense him taking up the leadership and the thread his grandfather left him. He was taking up the family business in being the kind of reformer and church leader he was. We can't say that John Wesley was a Puritan, but there were many shared elements, and he certainly was his grandfather's grandson. So rather than a separating instinct, he had a reforming instinct. And rather than emphasizing political power, as so many spiritual movements do, he emphasized spiritual experience and transformation. So there's a consistent thread here, and I have to believe, given his relationship with his mother, that this is a direct thread. There's no indication that he ever had direct connection with his grandfather. His grandfather died well before he was born, certainly, and so we don't know how much he read other than what he's posted or how the kind of conversations he had with his mother, but there certainly was a embedded respect. Susanna and Samuel Wesley, his parents. Let's talk about his father for a little bit. John Wesley's father, Samuel, was likewise born into a dissenting family. Dissenters were those who, for whatever reason, rejected by the Church of England. In many cases, they included those from Puritan tradition. It wasn't only that. Anyone who couldn't sign the articles in the Church of England were rejected. So his father and grandfather were both removed from their positions as parish priests after refusing to accept the New Book of Common Prayer in 1662. His father was imprisoned for his dissent at one point. These were passionate people on both sides of Wesley's family. Samuel himself received his earliest schooling at a dissenting academy, but while in his teens was drawn to the Church of England. In fact, this act of conviction led him towards a passionate hostility towards those who were still dissenters, and academically allowed him to attend Exeter College at Oxford. So becoming a good member of the Church of England opened up a lot of professional doors that would have been closed otherwise in the declining favor of the dissenting tradition. But Samuel Wesley didn't do that for these social reasons. There's no indication that that's true. In fact, throughout his life, Samuel Wesley seemed to make things harder on himself and for his family for following his convictions and passion for scholarly writing rather than practical business or social gain. He wrote about his childhood experiences in school, noting that they were very lax. He noted the spiritual decline of those in that academy. And so you can see in his views, it wasn't rejecting them because they were outcasts, but because they weren't living up to what they were saying they were living up to. After serving in various capacities, he was appointed to the parish of Epworth in 1695, and that was a lifetime appointment. So this is a profound importance gift to the Wesley family. And it was purely because of his loyalty to the crown. So we see this political favor giving him an opportunity. However, how he used that opportunity wasn't certainly as helpful. He was a prophet of sorts. He spoke into his community out of Scripture, and in doing that, offended a lot of the people of power in his community, and that caused repercussions who didn't want to hear that. including potentially the fire. Now, there's some debate whether the fire was caused by parishioners. Some thought it was, some thought it wasn't. It's not proven. Assertions that it absolutely was are a little overblown. But still, there was a very fractious relationship between Samuel Annesley and many of the parishioners in the area, precisely because he just was bold in his statements against corruption or sin or whatever. In 1688, Samuel married Susanna, the youngest daughter of the well-known and respected leader, who we already talked about, Dr. Samuel Annesley. She too had rejected the dissenting position while a young teenager, out of her own personal choice. Susanna Wesley was a very strong-willed, intelligent woman all the way back to her earliest years, coming out of the kind of informal education and conversations she certainly had with Annesley, and the kind of people she probably interacted with. As his daughter, she grew up in very important circles, and we lose sight of that in her later life, and we tend to think of her in this backwater of Epworth, but she really did grow up in a kind of high society, and I wonder if that impacted likewise Wesley. She wasn't intimidated by those in power, because she had been part of that. She made her choices to move in different ways, and wasn't intimidated by social or spiritual discussions that tried to maybe lull her back. In a lot of ways, there was a big renewal movement, a reforming movement within the Church of England that was causing young people, there were young people even then, what Generation A, maybe we can call it, or Generation B, to return to the vitalizing experiences of the Church of England. There were these pastors who went around, revivalists essentially, who were calling people back to a spiritual devotion within the church, to leave behind the spiritual excesses and corruption that were in the dissenting group. So she actually was choosing a spiritual path as well. And it seems that her conversations with a young pastor named Samuel Wesley actually helped orient her theology and were part of her own spiritual journey even before their marriage. Susanna and Samuel were very different. They seemed to have a shared passion for the gospel, a shared passion for spiritual depth, a shared strong will that often can cause conflict in marriages. Where Samuel was emotional, Susanna was intellectual. She possessed a very, very strong mind. She possessed a very strong ability to reason. Samuel has been called by biographers as being learned, zealous, pious, affectionate when his prejudices were not aroused, but also obstinate, passionate, partisan, and pedantic. In contrast, Susanna is considered competent, businesslike, possessed of a cool, rational mentality, which contrasted strongly with Samuel's emotional and poetic temperament. Indeed, she was capable of defying her husband in matters ecclesiastical and of debating with her sons on questions theological. She had a strong will, strong mind, strong interaction, and yet society did not necessarily give her the kind of space or opportunities that the men in her life had. And so she did not have the same kind of public contribution, but behind the scenes her contribution was certainly profound. In a letter she wrote to John, she admitted this contrast between her and her husband, saying that 'tis an unhappiness almost peculiar to our family, that your father and I seldom think alike. Their lives were continually beset by financial problems that just wasn't Samuel's interest. He seems to be constantly distracted. Samuel spent 4 months in debtor's prison at one point, even though he seemed to have a pretty good regular income. And that forced Susanna to scrape enough funds and food to care for the family. So she did what she had to do, but it was a hard life for her. I like this quote from Susanna. There's nothing plainer than that of a free thinker as a free thinker, an atheist as an atheist. Is worse in that respect than a believer as a believer. But if that believer's practice does not correspond with his faith, he is worse than an infidel. There's nothing plainer than that a free thinker as a free thinker, an atheist as an atheist is worse in that respect than a believer as a believer. But if that believer's practice does not correspond with his faith, he is worse than an infidel. There's a lot more to say about Susanna Wesley, if you can't tell. Despite their different temperament and opinions, Susanna was a strong defender of her husband throughout their life. Once writing to her brother, who was angry about a bad business deal, "And I did not know that almighty wisdom hath views and ends in fixing the bounds of our habitation, are out of our kin. I should think it 1,000 pities that a man of his brightness and rare endowments of learning and useful knowledge in relation to the Church of God should be confined to an obscure corner of the country, where his talents are buried, and he is determined to a way of life for which he is not so well qualified. as I could wish. So much theology in this. She saw so much in her husband. She saw that he was being wasted in a backwater parish, and yet at the same time admitting his gifts were not as common. She had a lot of respect, and she saw the role of providence. So she said, "There's God is doing a work here, but it makes her sad." She believes in her husband and sees his lack of opportunity and his struggles in trying to be who he is in a context where that's not given freedom. We can say something similar about her, of course. Her great intelligence and her learning, her ability to teach and debate were buried in an era in which she was not given the opportunities the men around her had. And the Wesley daughters seem to have the same problem. From all indication, all the Wesley children were very intelligent and very well learned and thoughtful, but whereas the Wesley boys, Samuel Jr., we can call him, Charles and John, had these wonderful opportunities in ministry and life. The daughters were married to husbands of various levels of quality and seemed to just drift away. And so we have a lot of surviving letters of Susanna to her sons, but not as much to her daughters. And there seems to be a lot of chaos in connection to the daughters' experiences in life, precisely because that's the way women were treated at the time. Now, in light of that, it certainly seems true that Wesley's respect and inclusion of women in ministry from the very beginning really almost certainly was a result of his mother's influence in his life. Where when you have women who are teachers and giving you spiritual guidance and teaching you about the Bible, it's much harder to say women can't teach or speak. I know that's true in my own experiences with my mother, with women professors I've had over the years at formative times in undergraduate, where it's, of course women can teach and speak. Of course they have leadership because I've received the fruit of that. And so Wesley gave women opportunities, giving them space to preach and teach and lead in ways almost no other church body of his time did. Quakers were an exception. Susanna certainly was a strong reason for that. So let's talk a little bit about Methodism in the UK and Ireland as we close out this unit. And there's more significant detail in the readings, but is a little way of covering some highlights. Methodism began in England, reflected much of the conversations happening in the late 1600s through the early 1800s in its formation. So a lot of what we see in Methodism isn't isolated. It's part of these conversations philosophically, socially, and spiritually. It draws from resources and tradition, but it is also reflecting a very contextual kind of development in order and priorities. Methodism very much appealed to the lower and middle classes in England especially. We now say the UK after the unity of the countries later on, but in early Methodism we will primarily focus on England. Especially those in skilled trades, those who came from impoverished or poor backgrounds and learned skilled trades and built up an income based on their work. Those are the kind of people who saw a result from active work. And so they saw effort as a means to success and then saw this as a way of translating to spiritual pursuits. The Halevi thesis argues that Methodism was a big reason England avoided the kinds of revolution that gripped continental Europe. So we can see the impact of Methodism precisely among those who might be the most willing to foment revolution. It gave a proactive outlet to societal transformation. It oriented change in spiritual and social ways as together. So rather than saying we have to overthrow the government, there was a impulse to make transformations in yourself, and also in doing that to change society around you, and then you could actually see the changes taking place. So there wasn't as much of a need to somehow overthrow the monarchy. The transition of the English monarchy to being more of a figurehead happens because we don't need the king or queen to be in charge. We'll go ahead and make the changes, and you guys can keep your fancy houses and clothes. But Methodism also constrained excess, and sin abounds in indulgence of the passions, and where the passions are indulged, it's not only the kinds of drunkenness or sexuality or the things that are often highlighted, it's also a passion for power. It's a lust for acclaim. It reflects in a lot of ways. But rather than indulging these, Methodism encouraged thrift and patience, and those are the kind of characteristics that help people navigate tensions in society, whereas they might be encouraged, I want to make change right now because I'm passionate about this right now, and if I don't do it right now, nothing will happen. That's sort of indulging a kind of impatience about change, whereas Methodism says, keep at it. Little things add up, and then you'll see change together. Methodism continued in the UK, both England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, though after what is now the UK, though after the American Revolution and John Wesley's death, the American branch became much more independent and influential, both because of numbers and passions and all sorts of reasons. Early Methodism had both a Calvinist branch led by George Whitefield and Lady Huntington, and an Arminian branch led by the Wesleys and their successors. The Calvinist branch mostly withered, not entirely. It does survive in small numbers of congregations, and we certainly see later on a Calvinistic and Reformed approach to holiness. Now that's important as we go on later to talk about forms of holiness revival, and in a lot of the denominations that are currently part of the holiness movement, in which gather together both Arminian-oriented holiness groups and Calvinistic-oriented holiness groups based on doctrines of holiness and perfection. And in blending those together, you can still see the tensions in a lot of these denominations, though most people wouldn't be aware of that's actually an underlying issue. Methodism in Ireland faced the interreligious and intercultural challenges that resulted in English social and religious oppression. It's a cross-religious experience, and we don't have time to go into the experiences of Protestant versus Catholicism in Ireland, but it's profound. The kind of oppression that English and Puritans compounded this, not just the Church of England. It created a vast political social distinction. Methodism, however, sometimes served as a mediating voice between Catholic majority population and the Presbyterian, which is those who immigrated and occupied, we can say, Ireland, primarily came from Scotland and other places that had a Presbyterian organization. So Northern Ireland, for instance, is predominantly Protestant in a Presbyterian sense. We also have Anglican ruling classes in the rest of Ireland. And so whereas those traditions were a source of both religious and political power representing English rule, Methodism came as a alternative kind of Protestantism, reflecting a lower social strata, not in power, also often rejected by the powerful Protestants, and so they could have a dialogue and ability to relate to both sides. In regards to the way Methodism served as a way of honing and steering and providing social progress among the lower middle classes and skilled trades, we can see much the same experience among Pentecostalism in say, Latin America and elsewhere around the world, where there is a Pentecostal explosion, and oftentimes the Pentecostals are the ones who are teaching being hard workers, about saving money, about not giving into vices, and the kinds of behaviors that help people experience some sense of progress in their life and in their families. Now, that's not to say that is the sole answer to the problems existing in those contexts. But among the people who want to experience a kind of progress even before that happens from the top-down revolutions, which they can see are problems, there's a vision in Pentecostalism that reflects the early vision of Methodism of be holy as a part of practical experience in life that will help you better feed your family, that will help you find advancement in work and other things. So we see Pentecostalism as continuing the kind of Methodist values. And Methodism was a very dynamic experience in the way that the Pentecostalism is more now. And so as we get later on in talking about Pentecostalism's roots in Methodism, which is not 100% Wesleyan, but certainly has impacted by that, we also see how Pentecostalism carries on their kind of revivalistic holiness that is Methodism's result in England and Ireland and in early America.